And that's why people got confused, because they thought, well, freedom of movement is going to reduce immigration. It's only going to reduce immigration from EU countries. And it did do that. But non-EU nationals, immigration from non-EU nationals has skyrocketed.
Hello and welcome to Whatever Floats Your Vote. I'm Nick, a TV producer aiming for the effective communication of accurate information.
And my name's Phil. I like talking about politics.
Which is exactly what we're going to do. This is a podcast that explains politics so that you understand it and then can explain it to others. And that's it. We're kicking off 2026 with something we touched upon in our opener. And that's how, despite all the pre-referendum promises, immigration has increased dramatically post-Brexit. So Phil, over to you.
Right. Well, we probably should start with demonstrating, first of all, what exactly Brexit did to immigration, because before Brexit, certainly before the referendum, the experts were saying Brexit will actually result in higher immigration. And the people supporting Brexit that's mad. No, because we're going to get rid of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is the right of every EU citizen to go and take up any job that they can get in any other EEA country. That would have included the UK before Brexit. So it makes sense. And I get how for the public this is counterintuitive. You say Brexit made immigration go up. Don't be silly. But we have the data now. Brexit made immigration go up. So just to go through some figures, I can show you this graphically on the YouTube version. But for listeners, in the noughties, we did have, in the UK, an increase in net migration. So in 2000, I'm looking at a chart, so these are very rough figures. It was about 170-ish thousand. By 2010, at the end of the noughties, it was about 260,000. So there'd been an increase there. And then it carried on increasing in the tens as well. The peak was in 2015, where it reached about 330,000. That's net migration, about 330,000. After Brexit, in 2021, so at this point, freedom of movement doesn't exist. Freedom of movement is gone in Britain, and it's been replaced with the points-based immigration system that Brexit supporters called for, and net migration shot up to almost 500,000. So,
okay.
And that,
Phil, just to be clear, these migration figures pre-Brexit, these are from the whole of the world, or are these
No, this is
EU?
the UK.
But from the whole of the world rather than just EU citizens?
Oh, yes. I can break it up into EU and non-EU, because that is where it gets very interesting in a moment. Yes, but sorry, I mean, yes, this is from everywhere. So the peak before Brexit was about roughly 330,000 in 1 year. Straight away after Brexit, after the hard Brexit, once we've abandoned freedom of movement, it shoots up to, it's roughly about 480,000. And then in 2022, it shoots up even higher to about 760-ish thousand.
But
and then
Phil,
it falls away a little bit.
But, sorry, in the period post-referendum, pre-TCA, we're still in a transition period, aren't we? So technically, freedom of movement was still in place, wasn't it, or was it not?
It was, yes. The freedom of movement was in place right up until the end of 2020. However, net migration did go down before, it went down a little before we left. And that's because if you do split it into migration from EU countries and non-EU countries, that is because after the referendum, the amount of net migration from the EU actually was going down, because people were just not coming, even though they could still do it just as easily. The long-term prospects were more bleak, or there was a lot more uncertainty. And also remember, we abandoned freedom of movement at the end of 2020, but from 2016, it might have happened as early as 2018 or 2019. We didn't know. And that meant people from the EU didn't know. So there had been a reduction in the number of people coming to Britain to work, well, actually from all sources, but mostly we're talking about work visas when we're talking about immigration. And it was being reduced from the EU, but from the rest of the world, it was increasing. And the reason for that, of course, is they're coming for jobs. So we need the jobs filling. If you don't get those jobs filled, then you don't get that productivity. There was this idea that there was this queue of unemployed British people have been frozen out. Largely untrue, because if anything, unemployment's higher now, and we still can't fill jobs. But yeah, if you look at ever since we left the EU, net migration specifically from EU countries is negative. And that's why people got confused, because they thought, well, freedom of movement is going to reduce immigration. It's only going to reduce immigration from EU countries. And it did do that, because now someone from the EU, if they want to get a job somewhere else, if they want to get that job in the UK, they've got to apply for a work visa. But they don't need that visa to go and work in a different EU country. So it has made net migration, specifically with the EU, negative. Immigration's gone down. But non-EU nationals, immigration from non-EU nationals has skyrocketed, absolutely blown up. And there's multiple reasons for this, really. The first is that actually, ironically, ending freedom of movement and replacing it with a points-based immigration system means you're going to have more immigration. And if that sounds counterintuitive, this is how it works. So we removed the ability for EU citizens to come for any job, right? We removed their automatic right to get any job in Britain. That's a few 100 million people. But we made it easier for workers from the whole world to get a job in Britain, because the points-based immigration system does that. You know, just to be clear about what is our points-based immigration system, you need 70 points. If you have 70 points, you can get a work visa. No further questions asked. So how do you get these 70 points? There are 50 mandatory points. So the first 20 of those points is the offer from an approved sponsor? So for that, an employer just has to demonstrate they're a credible employer with the Home Office. They just have to get certification with the Home Office. 20 points, bosh. The next one is, and this is the only slight restriction, is the job at the equivalent of our A levels? So does the job can you demonstrate that the job requires some technical ability, which is whatever that country's equivalent of A levels is? If it is, that's another 20 points. Then there's an English language proficiency test, 10 points for that. And you have to have all of those. So really, this points-based immigration system has 3 requirements, plus you have to get 20 points from somewhere else. Now, if the job pays £38,700 or more, which is basically average for this country, then you've got your 20 points. That's it. Done. So actually, although it's been made, so all that's really happened with this is we made it harder for EU citizens to get menial low-paying work, like, for example, care work or, seasonal farm labour, working in cafes and hospitality, stuff like that. We made it harder for EU citizens to get those jobs. But we made it, and that's a few 100 million people in the EU, but we made it easier for the other 6.5 billion people around the world to get a job in Britain, as long as it's classed as a job that needs the equivalent of A levels, and the employer just has to make some case for that, and that it pays £38,700.
And how much easier is that than it was previously for people from outside of the EU?
That's significant, because we didn't have this system before, so work visas were much more difficult to get then.
Right.
And the reason we had to have, because you could say, well, why did we just not get rid of freedom of movement and keep the old system? And the reason would have been, remember, at this point, we've got several 100,000 immigrants in this each year coming into the country to work. Some are leaving as well, but you've got several 100,000. If you suddenly get rid of the EU citizens' easy way to get those jobs, there isn't a glut of British workers to do those jobs. We've seen that now. I mean, people said it before, but we've seen it now. It's proven now. So those jobs go unfilled. And if you imagine, if you've got a company, small or medium-sized company or large company, it doesn't matter. But if you've got a company that needs to employ a certain number of people to manage your production, and you can't get quite enough, and remember, some of these jobs require certain skills, then your business cannot function. Now, if you imagine a restaurant's the easiest way to picture it. Your restaurant cannot, you can't just hire some waiters. You need kitchen staff. So if you can't get trained cooks or chefs, you can't get your sous chefs, or you can't get your head chef or something like that of the appropriate skill level, then you can't get your customers in. or you can't serve as many, and the whole business might fold. So what the government had to do, and any government would have to do the same, it had to introduce an immigration system that still allowed people to hire those workers. It just meant that they would now be hiring them. Instead of from the EU as much, they'd have to hire them from further afield, say Asia and Africa, mostly because that's where a lot of people are who might find a salary in the UK, an average salary in the UK, attractive. And that brings us on to the second thing that caused the big explosion. So someone from the EU, imagine someone from the EU comes and gets a job in the UK. They might just come and do some work. It might be a 6-month contract, or it might be a 1-year contract, or it might just come and work for a couple of years. That's quite normal. They could even like commute in a weird sort of sense. I had a colleague, when I was teaching, I had a colleague once who didn't live anywhere near the college we were working at. But what he used to do is he had a flat share in the town where the college was. And he would be there for the term time weeks. And then at the weekend and the holidays, he would go back to his own home, which was like a lot of miles away. Well, you can do that in parts of the UK. If you live in the Netherlands or Belgium or Denmark or France, you might conceivably be able to come over, rent for the week, go home at the weekend or whatever. But more specifically, you might also go, well, I'll go and work in Britain for a year or two. But if you're coming from Asia or Africa, that's a much bigger move. So most of the people, if they're going to come and work in the UK from much further afield, they're looking at it as a long-term thing, which means they're going to bring their family. So straight away, instead of a nurse on the immigration figures, you've got a nurse, their husband or wife, and their children. And that's why the immigration figures absolutely rocketed up. Now, there was an extra factor, because the other thing we could do, if some people are still not convinced that it was Brexit that caused this skyrocketing, is you could compare it with the net migration figures of a comparable country, couldn't you? Like if you remember your science lessons, you want a control. Mm-hmm. So ideally what we'd want is a country that has the same population as the UK, same sized economy, roughly the same attitudes on immigration, and preferably next door. Can you think of such a country, Nick?
Well, are you talking from the UK? None of the UK. Well, France, Spain.
France basically. I mean, Spain's got a much smaller economy than we have and a much smaller population. France has got basically the same population size, same economy size, roughly the same immigration issues in its politics, and it's right next door to us. So France is a perfectly good control country, I'm going to argue.
Okay.
So what happened to France's net migration? First of all, the interesting thing, actually, when I've described our net migration increasing in the noughties and early tens, France's went down, which just highlights the fact that net migration wasn't anything to do with being in the EU. It was actually to do with government policy. We had governments, successive governments, that saw the benefit in growing our economy by being more welcoming to immigrant workers. France, the opposite was happening. But, so what happened in 2021? Because was it down to something else? No. France's net migration in 2021 didn't budge, whereas ours shot up. 2022, it went up a little bit because there was a common factor that made net migration go up for both the UK and France. And that was, of course, the war in Ukraine meant that we took in Ukrainian refugees. So did France. But in France, it went. We also took in that France didn't. We took in refugees from Hong Kong as well, if you remember.
Yes.
So that boosted the figures a little bit, but not to the tune of hundreds of thousands. And yet, in 2021, again, I'm not counting 2020 because COVID travel restrictions that went down then. But even compared to 2019, our net migration didn't quite double, but it went up by more than a couple of 100,000. And then it went up by more hundreds of thousands in 2022. It didn't in France. It stayed basically where it was in 2021. And it went up by a few tens of thousands in 2022 because of the Ukrainian refugee crisis. So there are no other. So the Brexit is the only factor that has caused that skyrocketing. And again, the experts know why. I understand how a lot of people would think, well, hang on, we're cancelling freedom of movement. Yeah, the freedom of movement had an impact. It means that net migration from the EU is negative now. We have more EU nationals leaving the UK than we have coming into the UK. And that has been the case all throughout this decade so far. So ever since we've left the EU, net migration for EU nationals is negative. But it has massively increased for the rest of the world. And again, part of that reason is what's called the family multiplier effect. If you're trying to attract workers from other parts of the world, from thousands of miles away, then they're not up for just moving over to Britain for a year or so. It's far too disruptive for their life. They're likely to see it as a long-term thing. In fact, they'll probably be looking at settlement, which means they're bringing their families with them.
Yeah. And I suppose there's a few things that have sort of dawned on me as you're discussing all this. The first is that obviously British businesses, the NHS, all of these people are coming over here because they are being actively recruited, because whichever operation is recruiting them, be it a restaurant chain, be it the NHS, be it care homes, they actively are trying to bring these people in because all of these separate, non-linked establishments or businesses, they're desperate for these people to come and work for them. It doesn't really matter where they're from. They have to come from somewhere, whether it's the EU or whether it's from the rest of the world. And then I suppose the other thing is that freedom of movement is only for people who are from a country within the single market or the EEA. Essentially, you can only use freedom of movement if you have a passport or an ID document that allows you to move freely within those countries. So you can't have freedom of movement. I think this is one of the things that has struck me, is that I think that people think that freedom of movement is people arriving on our shores in dinghies, when in fact you wouldn't need to arrive on a shore in a dinghy if you had freedom of movement, because you would show up on the border with a ferry, on a plane, at any border that you wanted with your passport, and you would say, I am an EU citizen or an EEA citizen, and I have freedom of movement between all of these countries. So that is not, the people on dinghies are not anything to do with freedom of movement, are they?
They're absolutely not coming from the EU.
No.
Even now, and even now that they would in theory need a visa, because no one's fleeing any EU country.
Well, and also if they were to come through the EU, so say, for example, people are coming from outside the EU and they manage to cross the whole of the EU and get on a dinghy and come to the UK, they're still not using freedom of movement, because they are, they're undocumented migrants. And I don't know how much that was properly explained. I don't think I ever heard freedom of movement properly explained during any of the referendum time or post, to be honest.
In fact, as you've bricked up, I would have discussed asylum later, but as you've discussing that, so there is a conflation here. First of all, in terms of people's attitudes, there is quite a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people think, first of all, that everyone arriving on one of these small boats is an asylum seeker. Many are, not everyone. But because of the high numbers of the small people arriving on the small boats, they therefore think that asylum numbers are much higher than they really are. Now, asylum numbers are significantly higher due to a number of factors, but one of them, again, is Brexit related. Now, one of the complaints I've heard, again, from Brexit supporters is someone can come across on a small boat, right, and claim asylum in the UK. Now, they might have already claimed asylum in an EU country and failed, which means they'll fail here as well, because we're applying the same UN Refugee Convention, right? We're applying the same rules. So if they fail in Italy or Greece or Belgium, they'll fail in the UK. And the other reason they say, well, some of these may have criminal records that we don't know about. But the reason we don't know this is because we left that database. So as EU members, we were in something called the Dublin Agreement, which was a shared management of asylum. So first of all, if someone had have claimed asylum in any EU country and failed, they would not have been able to come to the UK. And if they'd have tried, they'd flag up on our database, they would be instantly deported. We can't do that now because we decided to leave that database. And the same thing with criminal records. We're not sharing information with European police forces, so we don't have access to the European police databases anymore.
Right.
So there could well be a lot of people claiming asylum in the UK that if we'd remained in the EU would not be able to do so. So although asylum is quite a small chunk of net migration, it has increased. Even that has increased because there are people in this country claiming asylum, taking on board a sort of unofficial double, it's the opposite of double jeopardy, really, because they've failed in the EU. They may have failed. Inevitably, there will be some people in this country trying to claim asylum who've failed in the EU, and we don't know about it. But we chose to not know about it.
But I
So that's
suppose if
another
somebody
aspect.
if somebody is claiming asylum in the EU or here, how would you find out about their criminal record anyway?
Well, if they've committed a crime in an EU country. Like, for example,
right,
famously, the media are perfectly happy to point out if an asylum seeker commits a crime in this country, well, they may do so in a different EU country. We won't know if they have a criminal record in their country of origin. They're fleeing.
That's what I was getting at. Right, so there's
that
no way
criminal
of finding
record
that out
maybe
anyway.
said something mean about the government.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be why they're fleeing.
And then I think the other thing I hear quite a lot, which I think we've all heard, is, soft touch UK. People are willing to travel the whole of the EU, the whole of the continent to get here because, we really are this utopia. We just free handouts, widescreen TVs, luxury hotel rooms, and then a lovely apartment for you and your family. Are we a soft touch? And is it a much more desirable place for us to be?
Not at all.
Sorry, for immigrants to be.
Not at all. It's a very hostile environment for immigrants, which is another reason why we're struggling to attract people from advanced economies such as EU countries now, because EU citizens can still apply to work here, but a lot of people say it's such a hostile environment now. And if you're trying to claim asylum,
sorry, Phil, I'm not. Yes, sorry, I'm talking about
specifically asylum,
the freeloaders in inverted commas.
But nonetheless, the same attitude, because what those people are trying to suggest is some of these asylum seekers aren't genuine refugees, because a lot of people in this country are not uncharitable. I've heard plenty of people who are supportive of anti-immigration moves who say they're absolutely fine with genuine refugees. They just don't believe that a lot of the asylum seekers are genuine refugees. So the same hostile environment would put off a non-genuine refugee. But also, a lot of refugees are homeless. A lot are homeless.
Would it put them off?
Because,
have we got, sorry to interrupt, but we got, the thing I'm getting at is this whole soft touch UK thing, in terms of if someone was to arrive here and say they weren't, their application wasn't genuine, they weren't fleeing a hostile country, if they were to succeed here, is their quality of life going to be significantly better because of handouts, free accommodation, benefits that they would achieve, that they would, qualify for here, that would be so far superior to anything they would get in other EU countries, that, we are such a desired place for them to come because of this soft touch UK we hear so much about?
Very unlikely, because you don't get automatic access to accommodation. You can claim asylum. The assumption is you have somewhere to live. So you then, just like someone who's a UK citizen that's has no home, you then have to go through the process of trying to claim things like accommodation, and the benefits, you don't really get benefit. You get a few pounds a week. You don't get the equivalent of universal credit,
which again isn't much. The cost of living crisis now. I mean, I noticed that everything is ludicrously expensive now. So I can't imagine for somebody who comes here with no job, no income, and lives essentially off the state, as people like to say, it's not going to be a very enjoyable lifestyle, is it?
The people the refugees who do have access to some state benefits, like the accommodation, for example, they've already been in the system for quite a long time. In fact, they should never have. The process shouldn't take that long. Part of the problem was the last government, the Conservative government, for several years decided it wasn't going to process any asylum claims that after a certain point. So we just let them build up and up and up. So that's why we have lots of unconventional accommodation needed, because we have this huge backlog. The last government weren't getting rid of them. They were just keeping them in the country. And because they were here, because they weren't processing the claims, the claims were taking so long that people were then going through the system of having to claim hardship funding effectively, because they had nowhere to live and they had no more money. And that's why we have this huge backlog, which we're currently now trying to clear. But if we had never let the backlog get up, then asylum itself would not be a serious issue. We know that we have more genuine asylum claims now because of climate change and political instability, particularly from Central Africa, driven largely by Russia doing it deliberately, because they know that refugees are a political sore point in Europe. But nonetheless, we'd easily be able to manage it. It should be a very small proportion of the overall immigration figures. And the vast majority of immigration is people who've come over here with a job offer, because there aren't many ways to be able to come to the UK. You can apply for asylum, but as soon as you've failed, then you will be deported. You can get a work visa, but that means there needs to be a job, and you have to have gone through this points-based system, which, as I say, makes it harder for an EU national to get that job, but easier for literally 7 billion people around the world, or the other 6.5 billion people around the world. I mean, the other thing to point out on that is, the other thing it does, because the points-based immigration system is based on a job that requires at least A-level and pays at least £37,800 a year, that effectively means that it's harder for immigrants to get relatively menial, low-paying jobs, for example, in the care sector and hospitality sector. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you look at polling of public attitudes, a lot of the public think that immigration should be less. And you can understand that, because when you start to see headlines of immigration figures getting up to nearly 1 million in 1 year, then of course people think, well, that needs to be much lower. But people in this country specifically do not want to see artificial constraints on immigration for the NHS, for the care sector, or for students. And yet, in order to get net migration down in this post-Brexit world, that's exactly what we've had to do. First of all, the Conservative government and now the Labour government have had to make it artificially more difficult to come to this country as a student who just comes in, pays a load of money to us, and then leaves after a few years.
And don't students pay more?
Yes.
Yeah, so foreign students pay extra than a UK student, which is surely a good thing for both the universities and the economy.
This is very damaging for our UK higher education sector, which is actually one of the few sectors that was able to grow even with Brexit, and yet we're artificially now constraining it. And of course, that has led to, inevitably, if you're going to reduce the number of foreign students that come to the country who do pay extra, that is, of course, now why tuition fees for UK students have had to now go up in line with inflation, because if we're not getting as much money from foreign students, we have to charge British students more.
Because foreign students are essentially subsidising the education of UK students.
Yeah, and they spend a lot of money in the economy. And just like every non-UK citizen living in the UK, to get access to you don't get automatic access to the NHS. That's not universal. That anyone who's gone to the NHS, whether it's to your GP or to hospital, they have to find you on the database before they will see you, right? So there's no such thing as turning up at a hospital and getting treatment. And in order to get an NHS number as a non-UK citizen, you have to pay what we colloquially call the NHS surcharge, which is an extra tax that you have to pay for yourself as well as all your children. And that's over and above. So if let's say you've got someone from Nigeria working in the NHS, a Nigerian nurse, and he or she earns the same as a British nurse on the same salary. But that Nigerian nurse pays more in taxes because they pay their income tax, they pay their national insurance, they pay their council tax, they pay all the other taxes, VAT and everything, and they pay the NHS surcharge. And if they have children, they pay it for them as well.
So another thing I think is that you've just, made the point well, is that people who come here to work have to pay tax.
Yes.
So there is obvious benefits for that. And the other thing is that most people aren't unwell. So, you wouldn't want to, no one wants to be ill. No one wishes to have to use the NHS. And if you're coming here to work and are of working age, the chances of you being unhealthy or becoming seriously unhealthy are probably very, very slim, aren't they? So this idea that migrants are a strain on the NHS is quite bizarre, really, isn't it?
It is. I mean, just the data proves it as well. You've got roughly 20% of NHS staff are migrants, whereas the percentage of migrants of our population is roughly 11-12%, something like that. So the reason is, as you've alluded to there, most immigrants in this country are working age. They've come here to work, which means they've already been educated and they're not retired. And who is it that mostly uses the NHS? Very young children and elderly people, which is the immigrant population of those age groups is very small. Immigrants can bring children with them. They may need the NHS. An immigrant might get injured or ill, but by and large, they don't. And this is why, if you look at the taxes paid by immigrants and then the benefits paid out to immigrants, the taxes brought in far exceeds the benefits paid out.
Yes. Yeah. And if we were to, there's been a bit of noise this week about this proposed, it might be possible that we may hit net zero, apparently, migration next year. Obviously, I don't think we will, but I think, it raises the issue of if we were to, I mean, you can imagine the headlines if we did hit net zero. I don't know who would be. I mean, it's almost like if we did and Farage wasn't in government, he'd be incredibly angry about this because it would mean he's got nothing left to. Would it?
Nope, he'd be delighted. And the reason for that is because the biggest government killer across the world over the last few years has been cost of living. And think about this. If we would, at the moment, we're on about a few 100,000. It has come down because we've artificially squeezed access for the care sector, the NHS and universities to attract foreigners, right? Which is mad. Those are the three areas the UK public don't think we should be artificially reducing immigration, but it's the easiest levers for the government to pull. So if we were to go from a few 100,000 literally to net zero immigration, then where are we getting the people to fill those jobs? Because in fact, I'll tell you what is likely to happen in 2026. For the first time, we are likely to have more deaths than births. So we've already had effectively a negative birth rate for decades, just like lots of advanced economies, and there's various reasons for that. We're now getting to the point where the domestic population is going to start shrinking. So if we want people to do jobs, unless, of course, AI does actually take over them all and we just get plugged into the matrix as fuel supplies. But if that doesn't happen, then where are we going to get people to do the jobs? We're not getting it from the domestic population. The domestic population is shrinking. There are from this year, statistically speaking, we have to wait for this year's data to be sure about this, but we're at that tipping point now where first of all, deaths are going to exceed births. But also think about this. The boomer generation, called such because it's a huge generation, they're starting to retire now. So the largest generation, working generation, is phasing into retirement now. And we've got a declining birth rate. And it's going to be effectively a negative domestic population growth now.
And the government's going to have to pay pensions for all of these huge amount of people entering into retirement.
Yeah. And they're not going to be paying even if they carry on working a bit, they're not going to pay any national insurance, which is a huge tax.
Yeah.
So even if they earn, it doesn't matter what tax, they won't pay national insurance ever. So you're talking about a generation that's huge. It's a huge part of the workforce. It's going to not be paying national insurance. As it gets older, they're statistically going to be needing the NHS more, as well as other public services. And they're not doing those jobs anymore.
So I think it's pretty clear that it would be very difficult to argue from everything that you've said so far that we don't need migrants for all of the reasons we've discussed. Where do you think that is going to be? Is it as simple as the EU? If we were to rejoin let's not talk rejoin the EU, let's just talk rejoining the single market, which is the fire that I think needs to be put out. If we were to rejoin the single market, is that the best way for us to recruit, use a horrible word, but to recruit people? Is there any argument stronger than saying we should just rejoin the single market and then return to freedom of movement so that we can recruit incredibly easy from the
We don't
continent.
even have to do that. We don't even have to. We should. There's huge economic benefits to doing so. We could do this unilaterally. We don't even need EU agreement. We could just unilaterally agree to allow freedom of movement. The EU, I'm sure, would be happy to work out a deal where it was mutual, but we wouldn't have to. We could just we can do whatever we like in terms of immigration. The government has complete control over it. They could
Is that
just
a Brexit
decide.
benefit, Phil?
No. What's had to happen realistically, because although I've described this points-based immigration system, right, that's the official system by which anyone around the world can very easily get a job. If you can speak a bit of basic English, if you're going to get a job, the employer can say, look, we need A-level equivalent here. And that could be most jobs. You can make a case for most jobs that there's some technical understanding required. It's a bit like, how many jobs are advertised as graduate jobs in this country? They're not graduate jobs. It's just because you would ideally have a graduate if you can for critical thinking skills. You can say the same about virtually any job that it's, requires A-level skills. You recruit someone from India or Nigeria or Chad or anywhere like that. And if you're paying about 38 grand a year, it's about average, there's no issues, you can get them. But because there are some jobs that we are in desperate short supply of, there's also an exemptions list that the Conservatives created, a list of jobs where you don't have to get the points. And that's the only way to manage it. So we effectively have much freer immigration than we did. And the reason for that is we used to just be able to have people from the EU get a job here.
But
quite
isn't
easily.
the difference that freedom of movement means that you can live in any of the other single market countries? So I suppose the argument is, if somebody comes over on a work visa, that doesn't mean that they're entitled to stay for as long as they like. If they lose their job, for example, does that mean that their ability to stay in the country is removed?
It is. And that's another problem that is actually harmful to our economy. Because, yes, your work visa has very strict, it's not just you can come and work in the UK, it's for a specific job. So it creates two problems. First of all, it allows the employer to potentially bully that employee because they can threaten to sack them and then they'd get kicked out of the country, right? But also that feeling of insecurity makes it more difficult to attract those people. Whereas you'd much rather be able to hire EU workers who will feel safe and secure, because if they did lose their job and they wanted to carry on living here, they'd be eligible to get another job, or they'd be eligible to stay here as long as it needed to get another job. Whereas, someone coming on a work visa, if any of the terms of that visa are no longer valid, then they're no longer lawfully in the country. So they could lose their job, and literally that's it. You've got to pack your bags now. Well, they might have been living here for several years.
That probably sounds quite attractive to people who want to control our borders, control immigration. I think the freedom of movement argument was that it was this uncontrolled toing and froing of people across the border, unchecked. Anyone can go anywhere for however long. And I think if you're somebody who doesn't like the idea of uncontrolled migration, the argument, what you've just explained about the points-based system and working visas, that's probably quite attractive to people who on paper would go, well, actually, we can recruit who we want and we have the ability to recruit whoever we want. Whether they can get them or not is another factor. But I think it's quite hard to get people to change their opinion on freedom of movement based on everything you've just said, because we do have the ability to recruit who we want.
But there's a couple of things. First of all, as I pointed out earlier, although people think that net migration increased for most of this millennium, or certainly the first 15 years of it, and people thought, well, that was because of our EU membership, it declined in France at the same time. So it shows that actually it was down to national policy. A lot of aspects of freedom, a lot of employment law that people thought was EU law wasn't. It was actually UK. But also, there's economic reality. So yes, we can absolutely tighten immigration. We can ban immigration. We can say we're not going to issue any work visas. But people should understand what the consequences of that are. The consequences of that will be that a lot of businesses will go under. Businesses won't invest in the UK, and that's not just foreign businesses. There were already UK-owned businesses that said that they were about to invest before Brexit. They were going to invest in expansion in the UK, and they put those plans on hold. And they've actually had to now use that investment in the EU because that's where the larger market is. So you have to accept that if you want to reduce immigration, you're reducing your economy. It's really this simple. The Bank of England made it clear a couple of years ago that the only growth we've had over the preceding few years, they said this in 2024, was from immigration. Immigration is always a source of economic growth because people don't just randomly come here and demand a job. We don't have guaranteed jobs. So someone like me very much on the left thinks we should, but we don't. So people can only come across here if there is a job anyway. And think about it from the point of view of someone employing them in this country. There's more paperwork for employing a migrant worker. It's actually more hassle. You would rather employ a British worker because it's more hassle if you don't. And if you get caught out, like let's say you're checking their credentials and pass it, and if you don't do a proper job and the Home Office find out that that person didn't have right to work in the UK, your company's going to get fined tens of thousands of pounds. So the paperwork is much easier to deal with a British citizen or someone with settled rights in the UK, that is. It could still be a foreign, but settled in the UK, so they've been living here for a long time. If you employ someone from overseas, that's more paperwork for you. It's more hassle. It's more risk if you don't do a good job of checking all their paperwork. So by definition, if there are jobs that are going to migrants in this country, then it's because those employers, by and large, cannot find people in the domestic population to do those jobs. Classic case is seasonal farm labour, but also care work. There's plenty of care work out there, but it's a tough job. It's a very difficult sell, and it's not good pay.
Yeah, I was working at a company years ago called Leopard Films, and I did a lot of my work for them in my early career. And I didn't make this show, but a friend of mine did. They did a program called The Day the Immigrants Left. I think it was in the early mid-2000s. And I think they went to somewhere in Kent, I think. And essentially they went to 4 or 5 businesses. One was a restaurant, one was a farm. I think it was an asparagus farm, a few other examples. And they took the migrant workers out who were from the EU. And they said to the local population, they found some case studies. Okay, fine. You've been looking for work. You say that migrants are taking all your jobs. There you go. And I can't remember the exact outcome, but I'm pretty sure that almost every single person, obviously it's a TV show and it's not a totally accurate representation, but I know they didn't set these people up to fail, and every single person left the job said there is no way I'm doing that job, and it was very interesting and very ahead of its time. So I think, and I'm guessing all of these workers, care workers, farm workers, seasonal farm workers in particular, they're going to be earning under that 7,800 a year figure.
37,800. Yeah, absolutely. This is the problem we've got. We've made it easier for people all over the world to get jobs in the UK that are good jobs, and we've made it very, very difficult to get the jobs that British people won't do.
Whereas freedom of movement absolutely solved that problem, didn't it?
Yeah.
Because you could have people, and I suppose the other thing is if you're in the EU and you come to do seasonal work, it's a lot cheaper because you haven't got a big long haul flight from anywhere else outside of the EU, and you can hop back and forth. Whereas why would somebody come from the other side of the world to do a seasonal job when there's no job at the end of it for them?
They're not going to. So some farms have had to just stop planting as much. They can't grow as much. So we're actively reducing the amount of food we can produce ourselves, which means we're even more reliant on imports. Because at the end of the day, if you cannot have people pick the crops, then you've just spent money growing them and you can't recoup that money.
So do you think that if a party was serious about trying to reap the benefits of freedom of movement, would it be, how much of a battle do you think it would be for a party to take on the mantle and go, do you know what? We're going to explain the benefits of freedom of movement, and we are going to campaign on a platform of, we are going to not necessarily rejoin the EU, but we are going to solve the economic crisis in this country in large part by rejoining the single market. And that means freedom of movement and explaining it properly.
I think because there's such a mismatch between reality and public perception, like I've just said, a lot of the population think net migration should be low. I do worry that some of those people think based on the figures as they were a few years ago rather than now. But nonetheless, people think net migration should be reduced, but they don't want it reduced. We know from polling for students, for the NHS and for the care sector. That's where the vast majority of it is. What I would like a government to do is to just be honest about trade-offs. Every big political policy has a trade-off. It always has a trade-off. And I would just be honest. I would say we can absolutely reduce net migration, but it's going to come at a cost to the economy. And try to bit by bit explain how. It will be very difficult because most of the media is not interested in telling this story. It hasn't been for 10 years. So it is difficult for governments to get out anything other than simple messages. But I would like them to at least say, this is a choice. Rather than telling the public what they should think, say to them, this is the choice you have, which is it to be? We could do that on several things, I think. That would be better, to put it to people that if, the reason why these people are coming here is because for doing jobs. If we don't have those jobs done, then those businesses cannot succeed. People will not invest. They will not expand in this country. They will not set up shop in this country if they cannot get access to the workers they need. That the domestic population is shrinking. It's shrinking. It's getting smaller. And every advanced economy in the world has a lot of migrant labor. Every single one. There's not such thing as a rich country that doesn't have a lot of migrant labor.
No. And I think two of the things that the Leave campaign in their two various forms realised and campaigned hard on, that they thought that the two biggest issues for most Brits, the things they cared about most, were the NHS and migration. Yeah. So if you could convince the public with, not lie to them, just tell them the truth that our NHS, I'll tell you what, a different way, Phil, is our NHS worse off because we don't have freedom of movement anymore? And would our NHS be better off if we were to go back to freedom of movement, and why?
It would. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is what I would do if I was to go, and I'm sort of data driven, I would, and I've said this before, I wouldn't just post, you post the net migration figures, don't look like you're trying to conceal anything, but I would split it into types. I would split it into net migration for the NHS, net migration for the care sector, net migration for students, split it into types of immigration, because I think the public disapprove of certain types of immigration and they're supportive of others. So why lump it all together? Split it all up, split it up. But then in terms of like in the NHS, you've got to think about, why would doctors or nurses at the moment, and again, I would be completely honest with the public, why would doctors, nurses, paramedics and so on come to work in the NHS from abroad where they're subject to a hostile environment? We've got a report again out today, not the first, talking about the excessive amount of physical and verbal threats towards NHS staff. And some of that is racially aggravated. Why would they come to work here against that sort of background? There's only two. What are your pull factors? There's plenty of push factors pushing people out of the NHS. What are the pull factors? It can only be pay, but our pay has become uncompetitive over the years since Brexit, ironically. Because, of course, our economy is smaller, which means we don't bring in as much tax. The second pull factor would be making it easier to come and work in the UK. But it's very difficult because of the visas required. It's easy for a doctor because their salary is very likely to be high enough to cover that. But again, a doctor could be welcome in lots of countries, whereas a lot of foreigners are not welcome in this country. There's a very hostile attitude, and it comes across in the media. If you're thinking of going to work in a different country as a doctor, and you're reading the news in the UK, you're not really going to feel welcome, are you? So the only thing that's going to attract you there is the process to apply for the job is easy. Well, it's not. Or the process is, although it's easier for the doctor than it is the nurse, or that the pay is really high, but it's not. It's higher in Ireland. You just go to Ireland instead, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, where you can, you still have, access to the EU.
And you don't have news media reports making it clear that the country is deeply unwelcoming to foreigners.
Yeah, and the cost of living is unbelievably high, which again is, I'm sure, lots to do with us leaving the single market.
Well, it is. We know that. I mean, it's recently worked out by American economists that our GDP would be 6 to 8% higher had we remained in the EU. That's single market and customs union together, as well as the EU. Because as well, I mean, like the customs union eases trade barriers, so that boosts trade. The single market eases other trade frictions, so that boosts trade. But also, if we were just in the single market and customs union, we still wouldn't get a say in how they were run. So being EU members also gave us a say. So we had a veto, for example, on any trade deals that might not have suited us.
And which countries do operate? Just for our listeners and viewers, which countries do operate out that aren't EU member states, but do also are members of the single market and have a customs union?
None.
So there's
none that are both in the single market and the customs union. Turkey is in a customs union with the EU, but not the single market. And then you've got the likes of Iceland, Switzerland, a couple of others who are like Norway in the single market, but not the customs union.
Of course. Right. Yeah. So that's, sort of EFTA, EEA.
So, there is no country that is in the single market and customs union with the EU, but not an EU member, because there would be no point. Like that would be literally, having all of your trade decided by others. Like if you're going to join the single market and the customs union, it would make sense just to be an EU member because you don't give up anything else for it. You only get more influence.
And I suppose it, in some ways, it's very similar in what you were saying earlier about we could just announce freedom of movement for EU workers coming into the UK, solve the problem, let as many EU workers as you want come in, they can work in the hospitals, they can work in the accounts. But if it's not reciprocal, I think, don't Brits want freedom of movement back onto the continent? We're hearing all these stories about 3-4 hour queues because of all the new EES checks. Surely there are a large number of British people who are really, really upset, and probably more and more now when they're experiencing the benefits. People want their freedom of movement back, don't they? Surely that's a big sell.
I think the British public have been deliberately deceived about the realities of lots of aspects of Brexit. They've had the problems of immigration massively over amplified in the news. They've had no stories about the benefits of Brexit. The benefits of being in the EU, I should say. It was known that during the EU referendum campaign that the big mistake the Remain campaign made, they made several, but one of the big mistakes was they didn't sell the positive case for the EU. It was all the bad things that were going to happen if we left, which all came true, but nonetheless, it was all just seen as too negative. There was no one really bothered to explain the benefits we get as EU members, sell the positive case for it. And a lot of people don't want to vote for a negative. They want to vote for a positive. And the Leave campaign sold them a positive. They said that immigration would go down. They told them that immigration, like the fundamental misinformation on immigration is this idea that people think, and they're allowed to think, that the country has a finite set of resources and therefore more people in the country means you're having to share those resources further. But the resources are not finite. particularly in Britain, we don't have a lot of natural resources to sell. Our trade is in terms of high value goods and services, mostly services. So our trade is based on workers. That's what we sell. We sell the productivity of workers. So when you have fewer workers, then it means several things. First of all, you are not as productive. So your economy gets smaller, physically smaller. It means that because most immigrants are working age and working, it means you're shrinking your pool of workers, but your retired population stays the same, which means that each individual worker then has to stump up more to pay for the retired population.
Yeah.
So, the public are not being informed about the facts here. And again, I wouldn't, if I was a political party, I wouldn't lecture to people. I wouldn't say this policy is the right one for this reason. I would actually just say to the public, we can go one of two ways, but you need to know the facts. You should be informed of the facts, and then you should choose what we want to do. So we can have much less immigration, but it's going to mean that we have more youth unemployment. We're going to have a larger retired to worker ratio. So that means each individual worker's going to have to pay more taxes to support the retired population, to support the NHS, because you and also, like I said, every UK worker just you pay your income tax, you pay your national insurance, you pay your VAT, and there's a few other smaller taxes, council tax, so on. Whereas a migrant worker pays all those things plus the NHS surcharge. So if you imagine the NHS, about 20% of its workers are foreign. If they were all to go, and let's say we somehow managed to find replacements in the UK, which we can't, by the way, but let's say we did, let's do magical thinking. The NHS would still have less money because the NHS surcharge would just be gone overnight.
Right.
And that raises a lot of money for the NHS. In fact, Boris Johnson in 2020, during the COVID crisis, and people were saying we really should be showing more appreciation for NHS workers. And a lot of MPs said we should really stop charging at least foreign NHS workers the NHS surcharge. And Boris Johnson said NHS funding would collapse without it. And he was not talking about getting rid of the NHS surcharge for all foreign workers, just foreign workers in the NHS. And he said NHS funding would collapse without it.
Yes. I mean, it's you make the case very well. And it doesn't seem that any of this there's no quick fix to any of this. There's no other option, is there?
There isn't, because the public are misinformed, which means it's impossible for a government to make the decisions that the public want. Like you've got this bridge, like the public want net migration to go down, but they don't want the government to restrict migration for students, for care workers, for NHS workers. That's where most of the immigration is. And
that's where most of the EU migration,
yes.
that's why freedom of movement was such a big benefit.
Yeah.
Because the people on the lower salaries could come here without needing the visas, without needing all of that stuff.
It had another benefit as well. British workers could just as easily go and work in the EU.
Yeah.
If you go to Germany, you go and work in a company in Germany, right, for a few years, you learn a whole new way of doing things. And then, like most migrants don't settle. Most migrants then, they go and work for a few years, come back home. You come back home, you've brought that wealth of experience. You've now bring into your new employer. You get a job in the same sector, presumably, in a British-based employer. And you can bring that experience of the way they do things in Germany, and that will include some things they do better. And and it's known that freedom of movement actually helps companies do better because you bring in together a whole wealth of experiences that help make that company stronger.
Yeah, and the other thing, I mean, even in TV now, you see lots of jobs. Most of us in TV are freelance. There's the ITV staff, BBC staff, a tiny percentage of television workers. We're mostly freelance. And you see a lot of jobs now advertised for all of the job. Any job that requires you to go and film on location in the EU, you see jobs advertised now for people with EU passports because we would have to have a working visa to go over there. So another
also,
massive...
you need Carnet.
Yo, don't talk to me about Carnet, honestly. I was talking to somebody else about this. I did a show in Gibraltar many years ago, and we needed a Carnet then. And it was only a few years later when I was naively saying to my wife, hold on a minute, why did we need a Carnet for Gibraltar? It was pre-Brexit. But Gibraltar wasn't an EU member state and never has been. So you did need a Carnet. And honestly, and I've had to do Carnet since. We had to go on a trip to Slovakia, then down to Madrid and then back, only for a few days. And it was an absolute nightmare. So, yeah, again,
Sorry, I just realised, probably should explain exactly what that is for people who might not know.
Yes.
Well, you could do that. I've been talking a lot.
Well, a Carnet essentially is something where all of your kit, and I'm going to, this is probably a very layman's terms explanation. I'm going to, in a practical sense, when you take cameras, microphones, tripods, all of the things that you need to go and film abroad, you have to take all of your gear with you. So you have to basically get this book, a really thick book, and you have to list every single, and I'm talking batteries, headphones, everything. You have to get a list of all of this stuff that you are taking with you, and you have to then take it. Bearing in mind, you're already lugging all this kit through an airport, which is not fun. It's heavy, it's cumbersome. You have to take it off to this special area to go and have this big book stamped, and they can, if they want to, check every single bit of kit. And then you get to the other side, and then you have to do exactly the same. You get off the plane, you get your gear, you go and wait. We did it somewhere recently, and they were sort of 20 minutes from shift change in Dubai, I think it was. And they just decided this guy just couldn't be bothered. So he was just giving us the runaround, and then his mate turned up, and all of a sudden his mate took it on, so wasted another half an hour. They check all of the kit. Can you get this? And they're pointing out bits of a lens with a name they've never heard of and asking you to prove that this long angle lens is this specific bit of kit, and then where's the serial number, where's this and that. So it's a massive, massive pain, and it's about VAT, isn't it? Or I think what they don't want you to do is that they don't want you to sell it over there.
Exactly. How do they know the difference between someone who's just taking it for work and is going to bring it back and someone who's exporting it?
Yeah.
So you don't get charged duties and stuff like that on it, yeah.
Yes, and the reason for this is now because we've left the single market and customs union, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we didn't used to need this because it was freedom of movement. Is that freedom of movement?
That's more single market and customs union.
Right.
Because if we're still in the single market, you could argue you'd still need it for customs duties. It's certainly a result of Brexit.
Yes.
If we'd stayed in the EU, it wouldn't be a thing. You would just be able to take your camera to an EU country, not a problem.
Yeah.
Because they don't care what you're doing with it. It's fine. No. You're all part of the same market and customs area.
Yes. Yes, just from personal experience. But I think to come back to our central point is that British people, if you gave most British people the choice, do you want your freedom of movement back? I would love to know what the answer to that question would be in terms of numbers. Yeah, if it was explained to them. Because at the moment, if you were to just ask the question, I see from polling, a lot are still very wary of freedom of movement. It's why you hear what is actually a very pro-EU government at the moment emphasising there's not going to be a return to freedom of movement. But if people understood what it actually was and the consequences of us losing it, I think the answer will be very different. And I think the answer will be very different on a lot of EU-related issues. Yes, but I do think that if freedom of movement was explained properly, really, really properly, so that everyone actually understood it, I think it would be... I don't see an argument for Brexit if the public support, majority support for freedom of movement was high. I can't see Brexit surviving, can you? No, it's very difficult to imagine a population will ever vote to be a poorer country. And yet that's what you're doing. Because, again, people think that the country has this finite resources and we're just like... It's almost like we're giving out money as a charity thing. So, no, you're earning that money, you're working for that money, and so is a migrant worker. They are being productive and they are rewarded for their productivity. If that worker isn't there, the productivity doesn't happen. Whatever they're producing doesn't get made. Yeah. And they also pay tax on their earnings.
They pay more tax on their earnings than you or I do on the same earnings. A migrant worker earning the same as me pays more tax because they pay the NHS surcharge as well. And they'll also have visa fees and things like that. And they are constantly having the sort of Damocles above their head, because if their employment ceases, their work visa is no longer valid. And it used to be the case that you would have, after 5 years of being a nice, law-abiding, tax-paying citizen, you could apply for settled status. And now the government have wanted to change that to 10 years. So that's an even tougher sell to get migrant workers in the country. But of course, the policy is to do that. The policy is specifically to make us a less attractive destination for foreign workers. But that is the definition of managed decline, unless the government think that AI is not just going to take over a load of jobs, but specifically take over the jobs that migrant workers are doing. Then that's going to mean a smaller economy.
Thought process. Surely not.
I mean, AI is not going to take over care work, I'll tell you that much, and it's not going to become a nurse for you. And nor is it going to become a foreign student.
And not in the time period that would be required to keep anybody in power anyway. No. So I can't imagine that's the strategy. Well, I suppose to summarise then, Phil, we started this by asking why immigration has gone up post-Brexit. And I suppose the summary I'm getting is that it's because we have made it, even though freedom of movement has ended and EU workers cannot come here freely as they could before, we have made it easier for non-EU workers to come here because we need them. We will always need them in all of the industries that we've discussed and in the NHS and places that people care about. So it's not a question of do we need migrants, it's a question of where are they going to come from. Yeah. Is that accurate?
That is pretty much it. And we could unilaterally say, well, there's certain countries that we're more aligned with, and we could allow freedom of movement. We could do it for America if you wanted. If you're going to do it unilaterally, you don't have to restrict it to just the EU. You could say, anyone from a whole, set of countries, and it could include America and Canada if we wanted. We could do that. But again, because people have this net migration figure in their head and they've lumped all sorts of immigration into it, which is desirable and undesirable, it's a problem. The government just feels it has to keep getting net migration down and down and down. There's never been a conversation with the public. Well, hang on, what level is acceptable? And also, which types of immigration are the problem? And just split the data into types of immigration.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. Well, maybe we should do that. I don't know how readily available those figures are, but if they are readily available, maybe we should put them out there.
It's quite difficult. I mean, you ideally want the government to tell the ONS to do it.
Okay, well, if anyone's listening, tell the government to do to tell the ONS to do it. But maybe that's a long shot. Well, Phil, that's very, very interesting. Thank you so much, and I hope that's made it. It's certainly made it a lot clearer to me. I hope it's made it clearer for all of you listening and watching. And that is all that we've got time for this week. We hope you've enjoyed watching, listening, and thank you so much for joining us. And please like, share, and get the message out there. And we'll hopefully see you all again soon. Phil, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.